He burned every letter she ever sent him. 7 years, every blood moon, the same ritual, fire-eating paper, ash falling into the grate, the king of wolves refusing to read a single word from the woman he exiled. He told himself it was justice. He told himself she deserved the silence. But tonight, an old man with dirt under his fingernails and grief in his eyes just told Cale Draven something that cracked the floor open beneath his boots. Those letters weren't mailed from any village, any border town, any exile's cottage. They came from a cemetery. She's been dead for years, and he burned every word she tried to leave him. Stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments, because where you're watching from tonight, this story is going to follow you home. The blood moon rose fat and red over Ashen Vale the way it always did. Slow, deliberate, like a wound reopening on schedule. Cale Draven stood on the eastern parapet of the crown fortress and watched it climb, one hand wrapped around a stone merlon that had outlasted 3 generations of kings before him. The festival noise drifted up from the lower city. Drums, fire dancers, the smell of spiced meat and wood smoke threading through cold air. His people celebrating the old cycle, the turn of the year, the night the dead were said to walk closer to the living than at any other time. He'd stopped participating in the blood moon ceremonies 6 years ago. His advisors had framed it as dignified restraint, a king above superstition. What it actually was, Kyle knew, was that he couldn't stand the lanterns. Every household in the kingdom lit a lantern for someone lost. The lower city went gold with them, and every year that gold light climbed up to the parapet where he stood and made him think of her eyes. He refused to think of her eyes. Your Grace. His captain, Ren Aldrich, materialized at his left shoulder the way he always did, quiet, solid, carrying the faint smell of leather and iron. The elders are assembled in the Hall of Bone. They're asking if you'll observe the rite this year. No, Ren didn't push. That was why he'd lasted 11 years as Kyle's captain when 3 others before him had not. He understood the difference between questions that had answers and statements that closed like doors. The drums pulsed below. A ribbon of fire arced across the festival square as one of the performers threw a torch in a long wheel. The crowd roared. Cale watched it all from above with the expression of a man reading weather, assessing, cataloging, feeling nothing he hadn't chosen to feel. There's someone at the eastern gate, Ren said, after a moment. He's been there since dusk. Won't leave. Guards say he's old, half blind by the look of him. He says he has something for you personally. He says... Ren paused. The pause itself was unusual. He says it concerns the cemetery at Exile. Cale's jaw tightened. One small movement, almost nothing. Turn him away. He says he won't be turned. He says he'll stand there until the moon goes down and come back every blood moon after that until you hear him. Then let him stand. He meant it. He went back inside, let the heavy door cut the festival noise to a murmur, and walked the long corridor toward his private study. Stone walls, iron sconces, a kingdom's worth of maps and dispatches, and the accumulated weight of 7 years on the throne without an heir, without a queen, without anything resembling what the blood moon was supposed to celebrate. He poured himself a measure of black pine whiskey and didn't drink it, just held it. Watched the fire in the grate. There was a basket beside the hearth. Bronze, dented, old. Every blood moon his steward placed it there as a matter of duty, because the letters arrived every blood moon without fail, and the protocol had been established in the first year. Bring them, burn them, don't mention them. The basket held this year's letter, a single envelope sealed in gray wax, addressed in the same handwriting that had appeared 11 times before. Neat. Controlled. The handwriting of someone who'd learned to write under strict instruction. He looked at it the way a man looks at a scar. Recognition without pleasure. Then he burned it. Took it from the basket, held the corner to the fire, and watched orange eat through the paper until gray wax ran and the envelope curled into black. He dropped it in the grate and watched it finish dying. That was the ritual. Simple. Efficient. It cost him nothing. He was back at his desk and opening the evening's trade dispatches when Ren knocked again. 2 knocks, then a third. The pattern that meant something had shifted. What? Ren opened the door. His face was arranged the way it got when he was carrying news he hadn't decided how to deliver yet. The old man. He got past the gate. Kyle set down the dispatch. How? Walked through, apparently. Your Grace, I know how that sounds. The guards are... They don't have a good account of it. He's in the lower corridor. He's not armed. He's... Wren stopped. He's a gravekeeper. From Exile. He has his identification papers. He's 80 years old if he's a day, and he says, "Bring him up." Wren blinked. That had not been the expected response. "Bring him up," Kael said again, and turned back to the fire. The gravekeeper's name was Edric Sorn. He came in slowly, walking with a cane that had been worn smooth by years of hands, wearing a coat that had been patched so many times the original fabric was almost a minority. His eyes were pale blue, going cloudy at the edges. His hands, when he stood before Kael's desk without being invited to sit, were enormous. Thick-knuckled, soil-darkened, the hands of a man who had spent his life digging into earth. He didn't bow. He looked at Kael the way very old men sometimes looked at kings, without the particular fear that usually occupied that space. Like he'd been alive long enough to understand that kings were just men who'd survived longer than most. "You're Kael Draven," he said. His voice was rough-bottomed, like gravel shifting in a barrel. "You know who I am. I know what you look like from the festival portraits they hang in the lower city." Edric Sorn looked at the portraits like he didn't think much of them. "You look worse in person, like you haven't slept regular in years." Wren made a small movement at the door. Kael held up one finger without looking at him, and Wren went still. "You walked through my gate," Kael said. "Your guards are young. Young men with torches and festival mead in their blood aren't the most attentive." The old man shrugged one shoulder. "I'm 83 years old, and I've been digging graves in Exile since before you were born. I figured I'd earned my way to the front of whatever line there was." Kael studied him. "Say what you came to say." Edric Sorn reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of envelopes held together with a length of rough twine. He set them on the desk. Kael recognized the handwriting on the top envelope immediately. His whole body recognized it before his mind finished the identification. Some animal response, some deep-layered reflex that hadn't died even after 7 years of deliberate burning. He didn't touch them. "Those letters," he said. "Some of them." The old man's voice dropped a register. Not softer, heavier. "The ones I kept. I couldn't keep them all. She wrote too many, and I'm only one man with only so much space, and I was never sure—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "I was never sure if you'd ever want to see." "What are you talking about?" "Those letters were sent from my cemetery." Edric Sorn looked at him directly. "Every blood moon for the last 7 years. They came from the plot at the northern edge, under the old yew tree. They came from the grave." The fire in the grate made the only sound in the room for a long moment. Somewhere below, the festival drums continued their pulse like a second heartbeat under the stone floor. "Get out," Kael said. "She's been in that ground for 6 years, Your Grace. Buried in November, the year after her exile. I dug the grave myself because there was no one else to do it. No family, no servants, nobody from the court who would acknowledge her. Just her and a woman who'd been her handmaid and an infant who—" The old man's voice caught on something. "The grave is real. I can take you there. I've been maintaining it all this time at my own expense because—" His jaw tightened. "Because somebody should have." Kael was on his feet. He didn't remember standing. "She is exiled. She was exiled 7 years ago for betrayal of bloodline. I know the charge." Edric Sorn didn't flinch. "I read the proclamation when it came through Exile. She came through Exile 3 days after it was issued, walking, in November, in boots that had come apart at the sole. She was carrying what little she could in a single cloth sack, and she was—" The old man's pale eyes held something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger, but sat between both. "She was further along than exile is any kind of condition to be in, Your Grace. She didn't complain. She found lodging in the town. She found work where she could find it. And 8 months after she arrived, she delivered a child in a room above a tanner's shop with no physician and no pack midwife because nobody in Exile was willing to assist the exiled mate of the Alpha King. The room was cold. Kael had not noticed the room being cold before this moment. His hands, he realized, were pressed flat against the desktop. He was using it to hold himself level. "The child," he said, "born alive. A boy. Strong lungs. I heard him from 3 streets away." Edric Sorn's voice didn't soften on this. It just stated it. flat, like a fact that had become too heavy for sentiment. She named him. She wrote it in her letters. She is... Kael stopped, started again. She was exiled for betrayal. She confessed. Did she? The old man didn't make it a question. There were witnesses, court testimony, a confession signed. I knew her for 8 months, Edric Sorn said. I knew her the way you know someone when you live in a small town and you watch them get up every morning and work and survive and come home at night and start again. She never spoke against you, not once. In 8 months, when she had every reason under the blood moon to curse your name into the ground, she never did. He touched the bundle of letters on the desk with one thick finger. Read them. Get out of my study. Read them. The finger pressed down. I came 80 miles in an old cart on a festival night because I've been carrying the weight of that cemetery for 6 years, and I'm 83 years old, and I'm tired of carrying it alone. You burned what she sent you. I know that. She knew that. The letters still came back, every blood moon, returned sealed. She kept writing anyway. His pale eyes held Kael without moving. That kind of faithful is worth the 80 miles, even to a king who doesn't want to hear it. Kael stood at his desk for a long, suspended moment. The festival drums below, the fire in the grate, the bundle of letters with their gray wax seals, and the handwriting he'd spent 7 years refusing to read. He looked at Ren, who stood near the door with the face of a man who had decided the best thing he could do was be a piece of furniture until further notice. Get him a room, Kael said quietly. Food, whatever he needs. Edric Sorn picked up his cane. I don't need rooms in a crown fortress. You'll have one tonight. Kael's voice didn't allow for argument. I'm not done with you yet. The old man considered this, then nodded once and allowed Ren to move him toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. Your Grace. He didn't look back. The letters she wrote, the last ones especially. She wasn't writing to beg forgiveness. She wasn't writing to curse you. She was writing because she had nobody else, and because... He stopped. Because love that's got nowhere to go has to go somewhere, even if it goes into fire. He walked out. Ren closed the door. Kael stood at his desk and did not move for a long time. He didn't open the letters that night. What he did instead was go down to the ash room, a storage chamber 2 levels below his study, where the servants disposed of fireplace contents before carrying them out in the morning. It was past midnight. The festival had wound down to its last embers in the lower city. The fortress corridors were quiet, the only sound the occasional footfall of a night guard and the settling of old stone. The ash room smelled of soot and cold and damp. Kael stood in the doorway with a lantern and looked at the accumulated grates of 11 years. His steward, he knew, was meticulous. The ashes were sorted by season, by location. It was obsessive record-keeping that had always mildly annoyed him, and now felt like the only coherent thing in the building. He found the Blood Moon grate deposits organized in a separate metal container, small, marked with each year's date in chalk on the side. 7 deposits. 11 letters, 1 per year since the first arrived the year after the exile. Plus tonight's. He'd burned them all. Systematically, without hesitation, without exception. He reached into the most recent deposit, still warm from tonight, and lifted out what remained, ash and a fragment, a single strip of paper no wider than 2 fingers, miraculously preserved at the edge of the fire's reach. The handwriting on it was scorched at one end but legible at the other. Just a few words, half a sentence. I hope you are well. I hope the kingdom is... He put it in his breast pocket. He stood in the ash room for another moment, then went back upstairs. Tet. By the time gray light began at the eastern windows, Kael had read 4 of the letters Edric Sorn had brought. Not all of them. He was working slowly, the way a man might move through territory he suspects is mined, deliberate, testing each step before committing weight to it. The first letter was dated 2 months after the exile. It was short, businesslike, almost, which told him more than any amount of grief would have. She'd written like a woman who knew the letter might be read by others first, like a woman who had learned caution down to her bones. The journey was long. I have found lodging in Grayville. I am not asking to return. I am not asking for anything. I wanted you to know I arrived safely in case knowing mattered to you. That was all. He sat with it for a long time. The second letter came from 6 months after the exile. Her handwriting had changed slightly, tighter, more controlled. The letters of someone who had been cold for a long time and learned to keep their body small against it. I have work at the mill. The town keeps its distance, but they don't trouble me directly. I understand this is more than I had reason to expect. I am managing. There is something I need to tell you. I have told no one here. I didn't know how to tell you in the first letter, and I don't know how now, but I know that silence on this particular matter is its own kind of betrayal. And I won't be guilty of the thing I was accused of. I am carrying your child. I know what this information is worth to you. I am not using it as a negotiation. I am not asking you to revoke the exile or acknowledge the child publicly or anything that would put you in a position you don't want to be in. I only tell you because it is true and because I decided 7 years ago, when I agreed to be your mate, that I would not lie to you. And I'm still keeping that agreement even now. He moves. I felt him first 2 weeks ago. I thought you should know that too, though I don't know why. Kael set the letter face down on the desk. He pressed both hands to his face, stayed there in the dark behind his own palms for a moment that had no edges, no clean borders. Then he took his hands down and picked up the third letter. It was dated from the year of her death, winter. The handwriting was slightly different again, not tighter this time, but more deliberate, like she was rationing energy. He's almost a year old now. He's loud and absolutely certain that the world is a place designed specifically for his amusement. I'm not sure where he gets that from. I have been unwell, nothing I'm going to dramatize for you. I simply want to be accurate. The winter here comes in hard. I do what I can. Someone came through Grayville last month asking questions about me. I don't know who sent them. 3 men, well-dressed, not from this region. They asked the innkeeper about my lodging, my routines, my visitors. I have no visitors, so that part was brief, but I noticed one of them had the Verath seal on his belt buckle. I mention this because you should know that someone in your court is watching me, and I don't think they're watching on your behalf. Kael's hands went still. Verath, Counselor Marin Verath, his longest-serving advisor, the man who had presented the original evidence of Celine's betrayal 7 years ago, who had provided the signed confession, who had built the case that led to the exile proclamation being signed in the first place. He read the sentence again. I mention this because you should know that someone in your court is watching me, and I don't think they're watching on your behalf. He went to his door and opened it. His night guard straightened instantly. Find Ren, now. Ren came in, still pulling his coat on, his hair uncombed, carrying the face of a man who had learned that being summoned in the pre-dawn hours rarely preceded pleasant conversation. Kael pushed the third letter across the desk without preamble. Ren read it standing. His expression changed in stages. The careful neutrality of a captain receiving information, then something harder and more specific as he registered the name. Verath, Ren said. She mentioned his seal. 3 men, asking about her movements. 6 years ago. Kael's voice was flat. Not the flatness of someone suppressing nothing, the flatness of someone suppressing everything that mattered. The case against her. The evidence came through him. The confession. The witnesses. I was not captain when the exile was issued. I know. I'm not asking you to have caught something you couldn't have caught. Kael looked at the fire. I'm asking you now. The witnesses from the original tribunal, Davin Corse, the 2 Alderholt brothers, the woman who served as her handmaid and testified against her. Where are they? Ren was quiet for a moment. Corse died. 3 years ago. Hunting accident. He said it carefully. And the Alderholt brothers. Edric Alderholt died 2 years after the exile. Heart failure, the records say. Paris Alderholt. Ren stopped. I don't know his current location. Find out. Kael stood. The handmaid. I don't... Ren stopped again, then quieter. I'll have to dig for her name. Then dig. Ren picked up the letter, read it once more, and set it down. He looked at Kael with the expression of a man who had served 11 years, and in those 11 years had learned when to not say certain things. Your Grace, he said instead. How many letters are there? 11, plus tonight's, which is Ash. Kael looked at the remaining 7 on his desk. She wrote every blood moon for 7 years, including the years after she was dead. He let that sit in the air between them, where it belonged. Someone was sending them for her, or something worse. Someone was sending them in her name to ensure I kept burning them, kept ignoring whatever she'd written while she was alive. Ren looked at the letters.
I want every man who served on the Exile Tribunal found, Kael said, quietly. I want Verath's correspondence records from the period of the exile pulled, not through his own office. Go through the archive master directly and tell him it's a closed tax audit review. Verath won't look twice at that. He paused. And I want to know everything about how Paris Alderholt died, because I would bet the crown he didn't. He didn't, Wren said, and something in his voice had gone very careful. He didn't die. He left court service 12 years ago, retired, the record says, to his family holdings in the Eastern Reach. He's still alive. Kael looked at him. Then he's the last witness standing from that tribunal. He said it slowly, which means either he's the one surviving person who can tell me what actually happened in that chamber, or he's the one surviving person who has spent 12 years hoping I never asked. Wren nodded once. I'll have a location by morning. He left. The door closed. Kael sat back down at his desk and picked up the fourth letter.
He read through dawn. The last festival lanterns went out in the lower city somewhere around the 4th hour. By the time thin light came gray through the eastern window, he had read 8 of the 11 letters, and he understood, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives not as revelation, but as the dreadful confirmation of something you'd always known and refused to look at. What had been done? The letters built their case the way she had apparently lived through it, steadily, without performance, without demanding that he believe her. She hadn't written to exonerate herself. She'd written the way a person writes when there is no one else to write to. She'd described the town, the work, the child growing. She'd described the winter and the woman who ran the boarding house and the way the yew trees at the edge of the cemetery looked in early frost. She described watching men come and go from the town who she was almost certain were not there by accident. She described one of them following her to the mill and standing at the road's edge until she went back inside. She described another appearing outside the boarding house 2 nights running. In the 6th letter, written when the boy was nearly 2 years old, she'd written, I don't know what they're waiting for. I don't know if it's a message to keep quiet or if it's something else. I've made an arrangement with the gravekeeper here, a man named Edric Sorn. He's agreed to keep copies of these letters if something happens to me. I know that sounds... The sentence broke off there, mid-thought, like she'd stopped herself from finishing it. Then below, I simply want there to be a record. Not for the courts, not for you. Just that there was a record somewhere that I existed and was honest and tried. He set that letter down very carefully, picked up the 7th. The 7th was dated 3 months before her death. It was shorter than the others, 2 pages instead of 4 or 5. Her handwriting was less controlled, not shaking, not collapsing, just slightly looser, like the mechanism that kept it neat was working harder than before. The child's name is Kael. I named him for the sound of your name and something softer both at once. I don't know if that was wise. I don't know most things anymore that I used to be certain about. He is remarkable. He has your eyes exactly. That particular shade that's not quite gray and not quite green, that color I used to watch change depending on your mood. He doesn't yet know that eyes can tell you things. He uses them simply to look at everything with absolute attention. Everything in the world is new to him. I try to remember that. It helps. I'm not going to be here much longer. I'm not writing that for sympathy. I'm writing it because I want you to know that I know, and I'm not afraid of it the way I was afraid of other things. What I'm afraid of is Kael. He is 2 years old and impossible and entirely himself, and I don't know what happens to him after. I've made arrangements with Edric Sorn for now, but Edric Sorn is old and this is a small town and Kael deserves... She didn't finish the sentence. Kael deserves what all children deserve. I know you know that. I know you'll do the right thing if you ever know he exists. I believe that. Even now. Even after everything, I believe that about you. That might be the most foolish thing I've ever written. Or it might be the only true thing I know for certain. Kael stood up abruptly, moved to the window. The lower city was beginning its morning below. Smoke rising from cook fires, the early movement of workers and market vendors, the ordinary machinery of people living their days. From up here it always looked like order, like a system functioning, like a thing he'd built and maintained. He stood at the window for a long time. The boy, Kael, 2 years old in the 7th letter, which meant he'd be 9 now, if he'd survived. If the arrangements with Edric Sorn had held, if no one had found him first. He turned from the window and crossed the room fast enough that he nearly hit the door before it opened, and the night guard outside startled back. Get me the gravekeeper, Kyle said. Right now. Dad.
Edric Sorn was awake when they brought him. He sat across from Kyle at the study table with a cup of something hot in those big dirt-seamed hands, and looked like a man who had not been particularly surprised to be collected at dawn. "The boy," Kyle said. "I had him until last year." The old man's voice was steady, too steady, the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this part of the conversation. "He was with me in Greyvale. Good boy. Sharp. Too sharp for a small town, honestly. Always asking questions I didn't know how to answer. His mother's eyes, but your—" He stopped himself. Took a sip from the cup. "Last year, men came. Different from the ones who came before. Better dressed. They had documentation, legal papers claiming wardship of an unnamed orphan child of unknown parentage assigned to a noble house on grounds of town vagrancy laws. It was all very official." Kale's voice came out flat and precise. "Which noble house?" Edric Sorn set the cup down. "The papers had the Verath seal on them. The fire in the grate, the gray dawn light at the windows, the 11 letters stacked on the desk beside the single scorched fragment that said, 'I hope you are well.'" "They took him," Kyle said. "There were 8 men. I'm 83. The old man's jaw was tight. "I reported to the town magistrate. The magistrate said the documents were legally sound and the matter was closed." He looked at Kyle directly. "I came to you as soon as I could travel. That was 3 weeks ago. I've been waiting at your gate for 3 weeks." Kyle was already moving. He crossed to the door and opened it before he'd finished thinking. The movement ahead of the decision, which was something that happened to him rarely, and only when something fundamental had cleared away the habit of deliberation. Ren was in the corridor. He'd never actually gone to bed. "Verath," Kale said. Ren looked at him. Read his face the way a man reads weather when the sky is doing something new and serious. "He's at his estate house inside the fortress walls. He arrived last night for the festival season. Lock it down. Nobody in or out. Not him, not his household staff, not a rat." Kale paused. "Quietly. I want him to think he's simply having a slow festival morning." Ren moved immediately, already calling orders to the guard at the end of the corridor. Kale turned back to the study. Edric Sorn was watching him from the table. "You knew this would happen when you came here," Kale said. "I knew something would have to happen." The old man reached into his coat and withdrew one more envelope. This one was different from the others. The seal was broken. Wax crumbled at the edges, like it had been opened once and pressed shut again by hands that weren't quite certain. "This one I couldn't bring myself to give you last night. I needed to know which way you were going first." He set it on the desk. The handwriting on the front was Celine's, but the date on the back was different. Not a blood moon date. A specific day. The day Edric Sorn's record book, which he'd also left on the desk, marked as her last. "She wrote that on her last day," the old man said simply. "She asked me to read it so I'd know what was in it. Then she asked me to keep it until I decided who needed it most." He stood, picked up his cane. "I've decided." He walked out. The door closed. Kale stood at the desk with the last letter in front of him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Below, the lower city was fully awake now, the ordinary morning of a kingdom that didn't know what its king was learning at dawn, 3 floors above them. He reached out and picked up the letter. He opened it. He read. When he finished, he was still for a long time. Then he set the letter down and read it again from the beginning. Slower this time. The way you read something you need to understand all the way through. The way you read something you already know you're going to carry for the rest of your life. The last line was very short. Kale is with Edric. He is safe for now. But if you are reading this, then Edric found his way to you, which means he was afraid, which means something has changed. Whatever has changed, you need to know this. Our son is still alive, and the man who framed me and destroyed us both has known about Kale since the beginning. He let me survive just long enough to watch what I loved, and then the sentence broke. There was a single ink mark after the dash, like a pen that had stopped moving mid-stroke, like a hand that had finished. Kale set the letter down. He walked to the door and opened it. "Ren," he said. His captain appeared from the end of the corridor at a run. "Verath has my son," Kale said. The blood moon had set. The festival ash was cold in the streets. In the study behind him,
11 letters weighted in a stack beside an ancient gravekeeper's log, and a single scorched fragment that held half a sentence he would spend the rest of his life trying to hear in full. And somewhere in the sealed wing of a nobleman's estate house, inside the walls of the very fortress Kael had built and ruled and called home for 11 years, a 9-year-old boy with gray-green eyes was waking up into a morning that was about to become the last ordinary one of his captivity. The king moved. Ren didn't ask questions. That was the thing about him. 11 years of service had calibrated him to the difference between a king giving orders and a king who had become something else entirely. What stood in that corridor in the gray pre-dawn was not the measured ruler who signed trade dispatches and held tribunal with the careful patience of a man who understood that power required performance. What stood there was something older than the crown, something that had been sleeping under 7 years of deliberate control and had just opened its eyes. "How many men does he have in the estate house?" Kyle's voice came out level. That levelness cost him something he couldn't name. His personal household, 4 guards, 2 body servants, his secretary. Ren was already moving alongside him, matching his pace down the corridor. He has no guests registered for the festival season. Arrived alone 2 nights ago. He didn't arrive alone. Kyle turned the corner toward the eastern stair. He arrived with 9 years of planning and a 9-year-old boy who has no idea who he is. He stopped at the top of the stair. "I want 6 men. Not the festival rotation, the night watch, the ones who were on duty before any of Verath's staff could observe the shift change. I want them at his door before he has breakfast." "And Verath himself?" "Bring him to me. Not the Great Hall. Not anywhere with witnesses." Kale's jaw was set. The lower council chamber, the one without windows. Ren went. His footsteps were fast and quiet on the stone, the particular efficiency of a man who had decided that whatever was happening was correct and required no further deliberation on his part. Kyle stood at the top of the stair alone for exactly 3 seconds. Then he went back to the study, picked up the last letter, and read the final line one more time. Not because he needed to. He'd already committed every word to the kind of memory that doesn't ask permission. He read it because he needed to feel the weight of it in his hands before he walked into a room with Marin Verath. "The man who framed me has known about Kale since the beginning." He set it down. Face up this time, unlike all the others. He wasn't going to turn it over again. Marin Verath was 61 years old, broad through the chest, with a silver-streaked beard he kept trimmed to precise lines, and the eyes of a man who had spent 4 decades in court politics, which meant eyes that never landed anywhere accidentally. He was dressed when they brought him, which told Kael he'd been awake, which told Kael that either he'd been warned or he was the kind of man who didn't sleep well during Blood Moon season. Kael suspected both. He came into the lower council chamber without resistance, which was the most telling thing of all. A man who resisted being collected at dawn had something to protect. A man who walked in smoothly, who sat without being asked, who folded his hands on the scarred table with the practiced ease of someone who had conducted 1,000 difficult meetings in rooms exactly like this one. That man had decided on a strategy. Kyle stood. He wasn't going to sit. The decision was deliberate, the same way every choice in this room from this moment forward was going to be deliberate. "Counselor Verath," he said. "Your Grace." Verath's voice was warm. It had always been warm. That was the thing about him, the specific quality that had made Kyle trust him for 11 years. He sounded like a man who was perpetually pleased to see you. "I apologize for my appearance. I was told this was urgent." "It is." "Of course." Verath looked around the chamber once, taking inventory, registering the absence of other counselors, the presence of Ren standing at the door, the particular quality of the room that said this was not an administrative meeting. Then his eyes came back to Kyle and stayed there, and the warmth remained exactly in place. "How can I serve?" Kyle said. "Where is the boy?" Verath's expression didn't move. Not the flicker of an eyelid, not the small adjustment of the mouth that would have told Kyle he'd landed somewhere unexpected. That stillness was its own answer. "I'm afraid I don't." Kyle said it the way you say a word to stop a door from closing. Flat. Final. "You have legal wardship documents filed 8 months ago for a male child, unnamed, from Greyville. The documents carry your seal. I want to know where he is." Verath looked at him for a long moment. Then he unfolded his hands and refolded them the other direction. A small, restless movement that was the first uncontrolled thing he'd done since entering the room.
That child, he said carefully, is the illegitimate offspring of an exiled traitor. The wardship was a legal protective measure filed under the minor vagrancy statutes to prevent. His mother's name was Celine Vale. Cale's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. She was my mate. She was innocent of every charge that came out of the tribunal you ran. She died in Greyville 6 years ago while her letters to me were being returned unopened. He paused. The child is my son, and you've had him for 8 months. Verath was quiet. In that quiet, Cale watched him. The way the older man's eyes moved very briefly to the left. The way his breathing adjusted. The chest expanding a fraction more than casual. The body doing its small arithmetic under the surface of the performance. The tribunal findings were sound, Verath said finally. I presented evidence gathered over. By who? I beg your pardon? The evidence. You gathered it, you presented it, you produced a signed confession. Kyle took one step forward. Just one. Enough to close the distance across the table by half. Enough that Verath had to make a small choice about whether to hold his ground or shift back. He held it. A woman who was 3 months pregnant, alone, in a court that had already decided she was guilty before the hearing opened, signed a confession. I want to know who was in the room when she signed it. That's a 12-year-old tribunal record, Your Grace. The participants are dead. Cale said it flat. Davin Corse, Edric Alderholt, both dead within 3 years of the exile. Paris Alderholt left court service and retired quietly to the Eastern Reach. He watched Verath's face. How convenient. Men die. Men retire. I can't be held accountable for. You can be held accountable for 8 months of unlawful detention of the heir to this throne. Cale's voice dropped. It went quiet the way pressure drops before a storm. Not calmer, but more concentrated. Which is what this is. Whatever documents you filed, whatever legal architecture you built around it, you took my son from the man his mother trusted with his life, and you have been holding him for 8 months. That's not a civil matter. That's not a wardship dispute. He let the word land where it needed to land. That is treason. Verath's hands went still on the table. I would be very careful, he said. His voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but something else had come up underneath it. The way a blade comes up under cloth, the way you feel the edge before you see it. Making accusations of that weight without a full counsel review could destabilize. I don't need a counsel review. Cale pulled the 7th letter from his coat and set it on the table between them. I need you to tell me where my son is. Right now. This morning. Verath looked at the letter. His eyes moved across Celine's handwriting. The mention of the Verath seal on the belts of the men who'd watched her cottage. And something happened in his face that was too fast and too controlled for Kyle to read cleanly. Not guilt. Something more calculated than guilt. The expression of a man assessing how much a document can actually prove. A letter from a convicted traitor, Verath said, written from exile, making unverifiable claims about. She's not a convicted traitor. She's a dead woman who wrote 11 letters I was never allowed to read. Kyle leaned forward, both hands on the table. And you are 61 years old, and you have spent 30 of those years in this court. And somewhere in this fortress, or somewhere in the city, or somewhere in a holding estate in your family's eastern holdings, there is a 9-year-old boy with gray-green eyes who does not know that his father is standing in this room right now, deciding how much mercy he feels. The silence in the chamber was total. Ren, at the door, had not moved. Verath looked at Kyle for a long moment. Then he looked at the letter again. Then he looked back up, and the warmth in his eyes had shifted into something that was almost respect. The particular respect that surfaces between men who understand that a situation has moved past a certain line. You read them, Verath said quietly. All of them. Last night. Yes. Verath nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd calculated as a possibility. I told them you would eventually. I was outvoted. He said it without visible emotion. The statement of a bureaucrat noting the record. Kyle went very still. Told who? Verath's mouth closed. The careful professional in him had already identified that he'd said something he hadn't planned to. Told who? Cale said again. Ren moved for the first time, 2 steps forward from the door, stopping behind Verath's left shoulder. Not touching, not threatening, just present,
the way a wall becomes present when you realize there's nowhere left to move. Verath looked at the table. He picked up the letter. Kael let him, and held it. His thumb moved across Celine's handwriting the way thumbs move across things when the mind is somewhere else. Working. Calculating the geometry of a situation, mapping all the distances between here and safety. "The boy is in the lower city," Verath said finally, "in a house on the Brackwater Lane. He's been kept well, fed, educated. Whatever you're imagining, I want you to know that the intent was never—" "The intent," Kael said, "does not interest me at all. Your Grace, you framed an innocent woman. You tortured a confession out of a pregnant woman." He said it bluntly, each word separate and deliberate, because the thing about certain facts was that they needed to be stated in the plainest possible language, or they became something you could argue around. You watched her die in exile while you monitored her movements with your own men. You waited until she was dead, and then you collected her child, and you have had him for 8 months. You told someone else, someone above you or beside you or behind you, that I would eventually read the letters, and that person decided to override you. He picked up the letter from Verath's hands. "That means this is larger than you, and you have about 30 seconds to decide whether you are going to spend whatever years you have left as the man who gave me my son back, or as the man who made me come find him." Verath's jaw moved. Something working in there, some final calculation. "Brackwater Lane," he said. "The blue-shuttered house, third from the end. He's with a woman. A minder. She works for me. She's done nothing illegal." "Ren," Kael straightened. "Already moving," Ren said from the door, and was gone. Kael looked at Marin Verath. The older man sat at the table with his folded hands and his silver-trimmed beard, and the careful stillness of a man who had just experienced the sensation of a very long structure beginning to come down. "The name," Kael said. "The one who outvoted you, the one above you in this." Verath met his eyes. For the first time in 11 years of knowing this man, Kael saw something in those eyes he had never seen there before. Fear. Not of Kael, of whoever else was waiting at the other end of this answer. "If I give you that name," Verath said quietly, "no guard you post and no wall you build is going to keep me alive until morning." The fire in the corridor torch outside made the shadow under the door flicker. Somewhere above them, the fortress was waking into its regular morning. Footsteps. The distant sound of the kitchen fires starting. A kingdom moving through its ordinary hours, while its king stood in a windowless room below ground and learned the shape of a conspiracy that had been growing inside his own walls for 12 years. "Then you'd better start talking fast," Kael said, "because when Ren brings that boy through the gate, whoever is watching this city is going to know the morning has changed. And right now, the safest place in this kingdom is the room where I can see you." Verath looked at him for a long moment, then he opened his mouth. And the name he said cracked the floor open for the second time in 12 hours. Because it wasn't a counselor's name, wasn't a noble house, wasn't any of the enemies Kael had catalogued in the long, wakeful hours since the gravekeeper sat down across from him. It was the name of someone who ate at his table. The name was Lord Commander Aldrich Voss. Kael stood in the windowless chamber and let the name settle into him the way cold water settles into stone, slowly, finding every crack. Aldrich Voss, his father's oldest friend, the man who had stood at the gate of the Crown Fortress the day Kael took the throne and said in front of the assembled court that he would give his life before he let harm come to this kingdom's bloodline. The man who had trained him, who had eaten at his table 3 times a week for 11 years, who had been present at the Exile tribunal seated to Kael's left and had said nothing when the confession was presented, nothing when the sentence was read, nothing when Celine was walked out of the hall, who had said, after, "You made the right decision. Hard choices are the ones that prove a king." Kael's hand, he realized, was pressed flat against the stone wall. He didn't remember putting it there. It was doing what hands do when the ground moves, finding something solid. "How long?" he said. Verath's voice came from very far away, though the man was 6 feet across the table. "The arrangement predates your reign. He approached me in your father's final year. He said the bloodline needed management, that your father had grown sentimental, and that the next king would need a strong foundation built beneath him before he understood enough to reject it. He built it beneath me. He built everything. The tribunal was his design. The evidence against Celine Vale, he identified her as a vulnerability the year before the accusation was made. He told me she was too independent, that a queen who formed her own alliances was a queen who could eventually choose different loyalties. Vareth's hands on the table were very still now. The stillness of a man who has decided that the only remaining move is full disclosure. I argued against the exile. I want you to know that. You presented the evidence. I presented what he gave me. By the time I understood the full shape of it, he stopped. I was already part of it. That's how it works. You take one step into something, and then there's a step behind you, and the ground is gone. Kael looked at him, looked at this man he had trusted for 11 years, this warm-voiced, careful architect of his court's inner workings, and felt something that wasn't quite rage, because rage was too simple and too clean for what was happening in his chest right now. What was there instead was something structural, the sensation of load-bearing walls being removed one by one, the building still standing, barely. "Get him confined," he said to the empty doorway. 2 guards had appeared there at some point. He hadn't registered when. "Full isolation, no communication in or out until I decide what to do with him." He walked out. The corridor outside the lower council chamber was long and straight, stone floor, iron sconces burning low in the early morning. Kael walked it at a pace that was not quite running and not quite anything else. The pace of a man who needs his body moving because the alternative is standing still with what he knows. Aldrich Voss, Lord Commander, the man responsible for the fortress guard, the military hierarchy, the chain of command that ran from the outermost border garrison to the soldiers standing at Kael's own door, who had full knowledge of every protective protocol, who knew which guards reported to whom, who had spent 11 years ensuring that the king's security apparatus answered, ultimately, to himself. The king's security apparatus. Kyle stopped walking. The guards he'd sent with Wren to Brackwater Lane, he'd told Wren to pull them from the night watch rotation, the pre-festival shift, men who wouldn't have been visible to Varath's household. But Wren's own communication to those guards, the orders passed down the chain, it would have gone through the standard command structure, which reported to Voss. He was already moving again before the thought finished. The eastern courtyard was pale with early light, the stones still dark from last night's dew, the fortress walls throwing long shadows across the ground. 3 of his guards were stationed at the courtyard entrance. He looked at their faces as he passed. Men he knew, men who had served through multiple rotations, men he had reviewed and approved and trusted. He kept moving. The main gate was ahead. Wren should have been back by now. Brackwater Lane was 20 minutes from the fortress on foot, less if you moved with purpose, and Wren moved with nothing but purpose. He should have been back. The gate guard, 2 men, young, festival rotation, straightened as Kael approached. "Captain Aldrich," Kael said. "Has he come through?" The guards exchanged a look. Small, involuntary. The kind of look that passes between men who have been told something and are deciding how to handle being asked about it directly. "Captain Wren Aldrich, Your Grace?" the left guard said. "Yes." He came back through, Your Grace, 20 minutes ago. He came through with..." The guard stopped. "Lord Commander Voss met him at the gate." Kael's heartbeat went somewhere very specific and very cold. "What do you mean, he met him?" "Lord Commander Voss was already at the gate when the captain came back through. He said there had been a change in protocol. He said he was taking personal command of the situation, Your Grace. He said you'd authorized it." The guard's voice had developed a faint tremor. Not fear exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man who is realizing mid-sentence that he may have done something wrong. He had his rank seal. He had... "Lord Commander Voss has the authority to..." "Where did they go?" "The Lord Commander took custody of the child, Your Grace, and..." "Where did they go?" The guard pointed east. The direction that led past the lower city, past the merchant quarter, past the edge of Ashenvale entirely, toward the older part of the fortress complex. The part that predated Kael's reign, that had been built by his grandfather, that contained among its many unused wings the sealed catacombs that ran beneath the northern cliff face and had been locked for 30 years. The Blood Moon ceremony space. The old ritual ground. Kael ran. He came through the fortress's eastern passage at speed and found the first body 40 feet in. Not a corpse. One of Wren's men, one of the night watch guards he'd sent to Brackwater Lane. The man was alive, breathing in shallow pulls, a wound at his temple that had bled considerably down the side of his face and soaked his collar. Kael crouched, checked his pulse, registered that he was stable, and kept moving. The second guard was on his feet, barely, leaning against the passage wall with both hands pressed to his ribs. He looked up when Kael came through, and his face did something complicated. "Your Grace." "The commander," he said. "I know what he said." Kael grabbed the man's arm, steadied him. "Ren. Where is Ren?" "He went ahead. He saw what Voss was doing. He tried to stop the transfer, but Voss had 6 men, and they weren't regular garrison, Your Grace. I don't know who they were." The guard's jaw was tight with the effort of staying upright. The boy was scared. He didn't make a sound. He just looked at everything with these eyes like he was trying to figure out the geometry of it. The man stopped. Captain Wren followed them into the lower passage. That was 10 minutes ago. Kael was already past him. The lower passage descended sharply, the stone changing from the cut granite of the main fortress to the rougher limestone of the older structure. The torches here were sparse and old, burning poorly in the enclosed air. Kael's boots on the stone made a sound that came back at him from the walls, doubled, like a second set of footsteps behind him. He pulled a torch from its bracket as he went. The passage opened after 200 yards into the antechamber of the catacombs, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of damp stone and old timber, lit by torches that had clearly been burning for less than an hour. Fresh placement. Someone had prepared this. Wren was in the antechamber. He was on his knees, not in submission. His hands were bound behind him with a leather cord, and 2 men Kael had never seen before were positioned at his shoulders, and there was a cut across his cheekbone that was bleeding freely down his jaw. But he was upright, and when Kael came through the passage entry, Wren's eyes found him immediately and held with the focused steadiness of a man who is managing pain and rage in roughly equal proportions and refusing to let either win. Aldrich Voss stood at the center of the antechamber. He was 64 years old, broad through the shoulders, gray-haired, with a face that had the weathered solidity of someone who had spent decades in military command and had stopped being bothered by most things. He was wearing his full Lord Commander's uniform, gold-threaded rank insignia at the collar, not festival dress, not morning informal, full formal military dress, at dawn, in a catacomb antechamber. He'd known this morning was coming. He'd dressed for it. "Kael," he said. "Not Your Grace." Kael, the way a man speaks a name he's been holding for a long time and is tired of carrying carefully. Kael looked at Wren. Wren was alive and functional, which meant Voss wanted something. Men who want nothing don't leave witnesses breathing. "Where's the boy?" Kael said. "He's safe." Voss said it with the familiar authority of a man accustomed to being believed. "He's been safe." That's been the point of all of this, Kael. Keeping things safe. Keeping the kingdom stable. Keeping the bloodline from being complicated by what? Kael's voice came out very flat. By the truth? Something moved in Voss's face. Not guilt. The man had clearly metabolized whatever guilt there was long ago, and what was left was the dense, settled certainty of someone who had decided, years back, that the ends were adequate justification and had not revisited the question since. What moved in his face instead was something closer to disappointment. The disappointment of a man who had built something very carefully and is watching it be misunderstood. By a woman who was not appropriate for the position she occupied, Voss said. Celine Vale was not a political asset. She was a liability. Her alliance networks were independent of court structure. Her loyalties were unverifiable, and she was... He paused. She was the kind of woman who changes a man. I watched her change your father's court through that kind of woman. I watched your father make decisions that nearly cost the kingdom everything because of personal attachment overriding strategic clarity. He looked at Kael with something that was almost genuine. I was not going to watch it happen to you. The torches guttered. The stone walls held the cold the way old stone does, relentlessly, without apology. You killed her, Kael said. She died of illness in exile. You sent men to watch her. You framed her. You coerced her confession. You exiled her while she was carrying my heir. You monitored her for 6 years, and then you waited until she was gone and took her son. Kael was very still, the stillness that precedes certain decisions. And then you spent 12 years sitting at my table telling me I was doing well. You were doing well. The kingdom, don't. The word came out with an edge that cut the older man's sentence cleanly in half. Don't tell me about the kingdom. You built a kingdom with a lie at the foundation, and you put me on top of it and called it a gift. His hands were not shaking. He noted this as a separate fact, removed from himself. His hands were still. The rest of him was doing something seismic and structural, and the hands were just quiet at the ends of his arms, holding the torch. Where is my son? Voss looked at him for a long moment. The assessment of a strategist reading a changed situation, recalculating distances and leverage. The boy cannot be acknowledged, Voss said. Not publicly, not as your heir. The circumstances of his birth, the exile, the mother's status. She was innocent. The court does not know that. The realm does not know that. Even if you produce every letter, even if you overturn the tribunal findings, the political fallout of acknowledging an heir born of a woman the realm believes was a convicted traitor. Then we'll deal with the political fallout. Gael. Voss's voice went to something lower, something that was almost, in a different context, in a world where the last 10 minutes had not occurred, almost paternal. Think about what you're doing. You have spent 11 years building stability. The border agreements, the trade compacts, the consolidation of the outer pacts, all of it rests on the perception of a unified, unquestioned crown. The moment you start digging up 12-year-old tribunal records, the moment you start naming conspiracies inside your own court, I'm not naming conspiracies. You're confessing to one. Kyle took a step forward, and you're doing it in front of my captain, which means you haven't finished deciding what this morning looks like. You haven't finished deciding whether you're negotiating or whether you're doing something else. He watched Voss's face. The boy, you brought him down here. The old ritual ground, the blood moon chamber. Something was assembling itself in his chest. Not fear, because fear was too simple, but something fear adjacent, the particular sensation of understanding arriving at the worst possible moment. You didn't bring him down here to negotiate. Voss looked at him. There are people, Voss said carefully, who have invested significantly in the current structure of this court. People who understood, when I explained the situation to them this morning, that an acknowledged illegitimate heir with a martyred mother represents a specific and serious threat to arrangements that have taken years to build. He paused. They were more decisive in their recommendation than I was. What does that mean? It means that I came to this antechamber to find a solution that preserved as many people as possible. It means that the men currently in the lower catacomb are not my men. Voss looked at him with something that had shifted. The certainty had fractured, and underneath it was something Kael recognized from the way Verath had looked at him in the council chamber. The fear of a man who has realized he is not in control of the thing he thought he controlled. It means I may have miscalculated the reach of what I started. The lower catacomb passage was behind Voss. 12 feet, heavy timber door, old iron hinges. On the other side of that door, somewhere in the dark under the northern cliffs, there was a 9-year-old boy with gray-green eyes who did not know his father existed. Kael looked at Voss, at the guards holding Ren, at the narrow passage in and the one-way through. The version of himself that had signed the Exile proclamation 12 years ago. The king who had trusted the evidence placed in front of him, who had believed the confession, who had stood in the great hall and said the word exile out loud and meant it. That version would have stopped here, would have called for reinforcements, would have built a careful strategy, consulted counsel, moved through channels. That version of himself had burned 11 letters. He handed the torch to the wall bracket beside him, straightened, looked at the 2 men holding Ren, calculated the distance, and said, very quietly, to Ren, "Down." Ren dropped, and Kael moved through the antechamber like something that had stopped being a king and started being what kings were before they learned to be careful. The first man went into the wall hard enough to crack the sconce bracket. The second caught Kael's elbow across the jaw and folded. Voss moved, not toward Kael but toward the catacomb door, which told Kael everything about what Voss actually intended. And so he caught the older man by the collar before the door opened and pulled him back and put him against the wall with one forearm across his chest. Voss looked at him. Something had left the older man's face. The command, the certainty, the decades of strategic calculation. What remained was older than any of that. What remained was a man of 64 years pressed against a limestone wall by someone he had trained who had become something he hadn't fully planned for. "The men in that room," Kyle said. "How many?" Voss's jaw worked. "How many?" "4." The word came out quiet. "They had orders, Kyle. If the situation became unmanageable, before dawn," Kyle said. The last line of Celine's last letter. The traitor who stole the throne plans to sacrifice the boy before dawn. She had known. She had somehow known, and she had written it into the last thing she ever wrote. That was the order. Before dawn. The light in the antechamber was still pre-dawn gray, still dark outside the catacomb walls. Still, barely, before dawn. He dropped Voss. Ren was on his feet, hands still bound, already moving to the catacomb door. Kyle reached it first, pulled the iron handle, and pushed through into the dark below. The torch he'd carried gone. Nothing ahead but old stone and the sound of water running somewhere deep in the limestone, and the very faint, very specific sound of a child who had decided that whatever was happening, he was not going to give whoever was in this room the satisfaction of hearing him afraid. That sound, silence worn like armor, the absolute controlled quiet of a small person who has learned that some rooms require you to be smaller than you are, hit Kyle somewhere below the sternum with a force that had no name in any language he knew. He went toward it. The catacomb was older than everything above it. Kyle felt that in the stone under his boots, the rough, unfinished cut of limestone laid before any king thought to make it beautiful, before any architect thought to make it useful. This was the original structure. The bones of the thing his grandfather had built, and his father had sealed, and he had simply inherited without question, the way kings inherit everything they don't think to examine. He moved through the dark with one hand on the wall and the specific contained focus of a man who has stripped everything unnecessary from his mind. No Verath in the antechamber, no Voss and whatever remained of his loyalty or his panic, no court, no council, no 11 years of carefully managed appearances. Just the passage and the sound of water in the limestone, and ahead, faint but present, the glow of torchlight around a bend in the wall. Ren was behind him, hands free now, Kale having cut the leather cord with his belt knife in the antechamber. Neither of them had spoken since the door. There are moments, Kale understood, that clarify a man entirely. Not the moments he plans for. The carefully prepared confrontations, the strategic ultimatums delivered from positions of power. The moments that clarify are the ones where the planning is gone, and what's left is only what a man actually is underneath it. He'd spent 11 years building a king on top of whatever he actually was. The catacomb had no interest in the king. He went around the bend. The chamber opened wide, 20 feet across, rough-hewn ceiling arching up into dark, 3 torches burning in wall brackets that hadn't been used in 30 years, judging by the rust on the iron. In the center of the chamber, sitting on the stone floor with his knees drawn up and his back against a limestone block that was probably older than the fortress above it, was a boy, 9 years old. Small for it, or maybe not. Kale had no reference, no stored memory of what 9 looked like on a child. Dark-haired, pale in the torchlight, wearing clothes that were too large, a brown wool coat that had been taken in at the shoulders by inexpert hands and still hung wrong. His hands were not bound. He was not visibly injured. His eyes, when they came up to find Kyle in the entry of the chamber, were gray-green, Celine's eyes and Kyle's color. The specific combination that Edric Sorn had mentioned and that Kyle had heard and filed away, and was now confronting in a body that was half his own, sitting on a catacomb floor at dawn with the composed stillness of a child who had learned, too early, the same way his mother had learned it, that some rooms required you to be very quiet and very still and very patient. 4 men in the chamber. Kyle registered them as his eyes moved, 2 near the far wall, 1 by the passage that continued deeper into the catacomb, 1 directly between him and the boy, weapons visible on all 4. None of them wore garrison colors. Voss had been accurate about that, at least. These were not his men. They were somebody else's men, and somebody else's men at this hour in this location with a child meant one specific thing. The man between Kyle and the boy had a blade already out. "Your Grace," he said. The voice was professional, empty of the things voices usually carry. Not angry, not afraid, not anything. The voice of someone for whom this was a function. This doesn't need to be complicated. Then step aside, Kael said.
I have a commission. From who? The man's jaw shifted slightly, not quite a smile. From the people who commissioned it. Kael looked at the boy. The boy looked back at him. No recognition there. Why would there be? But something else, some specific quality of attention. The boy was reading the room the way children read rooms when they have learned that rooms contain information adults don't always broadcast clearly. He was looking at Kael's face and at the man with the blade, and at the distance between them, and doing some private calculation with a child's version of the same cold arithmetic his father had been running since the antechamber. Ren moved left without being told. Kael moved right. The man with the blade tracked Kael, which was correct. Kael was the primary variable. And that was the opening. What followed was not elegant. It was not the controlled display of a king demonstrating authority. It was close and loud and cost Kael a cut across his left forearm from the blade before he got inside it, and then it was over for that man because Kael had his wrist and the stone floor waiting. The second man came from the right wall fast. Ren intercepted him with the efficiency of someone who had spent 11 years keeping his skills current, and the particular fury of a man who has been struck on the head and bound, and watched his king descend into a catacomb alone, and is settling his accounting. The third was at the far passage. He moved toward the boy instead of toward Kael, a tactical decision, using the child as leverage, and Kael made a choice in a fraction of a second that he would think about later. He crossed the chamber distance in a run that closed faster than the man expected, because the man had calculated the distance from a standing start, and Kael was already moving. He hit the man before he reached the boy. The impact went into the limestone wall, and both of them into the floor, and Kael's left arm screamed from the cut. And he registered the pain and set it aside, the way you set aside anything that isn't immediately useful, which was a thing he'd learned from his father's military training and had never expected to apply in a catacomb under his own fortress. The fourth man, the one by the deep passage entry. He was the one who'd been waiting. He had a crossbow. Kael looked at it from the floor, from the position of a man who has just put someone into the ground and is not in an optimal posture for responding to a ranged weapon. The bolt was knocked. The man's hands were steady. He was 12 feet away, which at this distance meant accuracy was not a significant variable. The chamber was silent, except for Ren and the second man still working out their disagreement near the far wall. "Stay down," the crossbowman said. Kael's left arm was bleeding through his sleeve. The stone under his hands was cold and damp. The boy, he could see the boy in his peripheral, still against the limestone block, still and watching, that impossible composure, was 4 feet to his left. He stayed down. Not because the man told him to, because the geometry of the room required it for exactly as long as it took to understand the geometry of the room. "You have a commission," Kael said from the floor. His voice came out steady, which was either good training or something else. "Before dawn, those were the orders." The man said nothing. "Dawn is in approximately 12 minutes. Kael shifted his weight slightly, testing the floor surface under his right hand. "Which means whoever gave you those orders has spent all night watching this situation deteriorate and is now watching a king on the floor of a catacomb and a commission that has about 12 minutes left on it." He looked at the crossbow man directly. "What happens to you when the commission expires and the man who gave it is in my custody talking about who signed what?" The man's hands were still steady, but his eyes moved. One small involuntary track to the left, toward the passage he'd been guarding, toward the exit, toward whatever was behind the weight of his current situation. Men who are fully committed to a thing don't look at exits. "My captain is going to finish what he's doing in about 30 seconds, Kael said. "When he does, the situation in this room changes. You know that. I know that. The commission has 12 minutes and a crossbow and a man who just looked at the passage behind him." He kept his voice level. No threat in it. Statement only, the way facts are stated. "Or you put it down and we talk about what you know and who sent you, and you walk out of this catacomb at sunrise instead of being carried out when they catalog what happened here." Silence. Water moving somewhere deep in the limestone. Ren's opponent hit the floor. Ren straightened, breathing hard, and looked across the chamber at the crossbow. He was 12 feet away on the wrong angle. Not a good approach on a knocked bolt, and he knew it, and he went still. The crossbow man looked at Kael, at Ren, at the boy against the limestone block, at the passage behind him. He put the crossbow down.
He sat down on the floor beside it with the expression of a man who has made a decision he is not entirely at peace with, but has made nonetheless. Kael got up. Wow. His arm needed binding, and he did it himself with a strip of his own coat lining, tight, functional, and ignored it after that. Ren had retrieved the crossbow and was watching the chamber's 4 occupants with the face of a man who has decided that trust is a resource he is temporarily not distributing. Kael walked to the boy. He stopped 3 feet away, crouched down so he wasn't towering over him, because this was a child who had been moved through the dark before dawn by strangers, and had been sitting on a catacomb floor for an indeterminate time doing that thing, that absolutely controlled, absolute silence thing. And the last thing Kael was going to do was loom. The boy looked at him. Up close, the resemblance was, it was a thing Kael hadn't been prepared for. Not just the eyes, the particular set of the jaw, the way his expression was assembled, guarded, precise, taking in information with a quality of attention that was not a child's usual scatter focus, but something narrower and more deliberate. Celine had looked at things that way. Kael had found it arresting in her. In a 9-year-old, it was devastating. "Are you hurt?" Kael said. The boy shook his head. Minimal, accurate. "Did they touch you?" Another head shake. Same economy. "My name is Kael." He said it without the title, deliberately. "I knew your mother." Something moved in the boy's face, very fast and very controlled. The movement of something significant passing behind a door that had learned to stay almost shut. His jaw tightened for 1 second and released. "She told me about you," the boy said. His voice was low for a child's voice. "Careful." "She said—" He stopped, reassembled. "She said you were the kind of man who did the wrong thing for reasons he thought were right." The words landed the way she would have known they'd land. Accurate, precise. No cruelty in them, but no softening either. Just the fact of it, in a child's voice, in a catacomb, at almost dawn. "She was right," Kael said. The boy looked at him for a moment longer, then he said, "She also said you'd figure it out eventually." Kael didn't have words for that. He stayed crouched on the damp stone and didn't have words, and let the fact of this boy, this impossible, composed, heartbreaking fact of him, exist in the space between them without trying to put anything over it. "Can we leave now?" the boy said. Practical, direct, his mother's son in every available way. "Yes," Kael said. "We can leave now." He stood and held out his hand, and after a moment, brief, considering, Kael took it. They came up through the passage with Ren behind them, and the crossbow man preceding them at Ren's instruction, and the other 3 men left secured in the catacomb with the grim practicality of men who would be collected properly once the morning was sorted. In the antechamber, Voss was still where Kael had left him. One of the original guards was also there now, recovered, grim-faced, holding himself like his ribs were a problem he was choosing not to advertise. Voss looked at Kael, looked at the boy. Something passed through the old commander's face that Kael couldn't fully read. Not triumph, not remorse. Something more complicated than either. The expression of a man who built something that became something else, and is watching the consequence walk up from underground holding a king's hand. "It's done then," Voss said. "It started," Kael said. He walked past him. The passage back to the main fortress was beginning to lighten as the dawn came properly through the small, high windows in the upper sections. The boy's hand in his was small and warm and held with the specific grip of someone who has decided to commit to a thing fully or not at all. Kael thought about Celine in a boarding house above a tanner's shop in Greyville, writing letters in the cold. Letters she knew were being burned, writing them anyway, because love that's got nowhere to go has to go somewhere. He thought about 11 years of sealed envelopes going into a grate, 11 years of ash in a bronze container in a storage room, 11 years of a kingdom built on a clean lie instead of a complicated truth. He thought about what it cost to build something on a foundation you never examined, about how long it takes for the weight above to work its way down to the crack at the bottom, about the particular recklessness of a man who assumes the floor will hold because it has held so far. The floor had held for 11 years. What was underneath it had not changed. They came out of the passage into the main corridor of the eastern wing, and the fortress opened up around them. Stone and iron, and the smell of morning fires starting in the kitchen, and the sounds of a household beginning its day. 2 garrison guards at the corridor junction went sharply alert when they saw Kael, read his face, read the boy, read the blood on his arm, and made the correct assessment that this was not a moment for procedural questions. "Find me every senior counselor," Kael said to the nearer one. "Great Hall, 1 hour, not optional." He looked at the other. "Send for the archive master. I want the original Exile tribunal records on the hall table before the council assembles. All of them." Both men moved. Ren fell into step beside him. The crossbow man was being handed off to the garrison with quiet instructions. The corridor ahead was clear. "Voss has allies on the council," Ren said. Low, factual. "I know. At least 3 of the senior lords, Cassin, Drew, possibly Mareth, have benefited significantly from arrangements Voss managed. When this goes public, they'll move to contain it." "Let them move." Kael kept walking. "A man who moves to contain something confirms the shape of it." Ren was quiet for a moment. Then, the crossbow man talked, not completely, but enough. "The commission came from Cassin. He was the one who outvoted Voss on the timing." Lord Cassin, head of the Eastern Noble Compact, one of the 3 men who sat closest to Kael at the council table, who had advised on every major trade arrangement for the past 8 years, who had attended Celine's Exile tribunal and sat with his hands folded and said nothing. 3 feet away on Kael's left, Kael was walking with his eyes moving across the fortress interior with that systematic attention, cataloging, filing, learning the geography of a place he had arrived in through the wrong door. "How many men can you trust?" Kael said to Ren. "Not the command hierarchy. You personally, men you have eaten with, men you have watched under pressure, men who report to you and not to Voss." Ren thought for exactly 2 seconds. 14, 20 if I have an hour." "You have 40 minutes. Ren's stride adjusted slightly. The almost imperceptible shift of a man reallocating internal resources. "The Great Hall convening is a trap. If Cassin knows the catacomb failed and you're bringing the boy into the open, he'll have the hall managed before the hour is up. Positioned men, controlled exits, a council majority primed to challenge the legitimacy of—" "I know." Kael said it without breaking stride. "Then why?" "Because I want him to try." The corridor opened ahead into the main atrium, gray morning light coming through the high windows in long, pale bars. "I want him in that hall with everything he's built and everyone he's paid, and all of it arranged exactly the way he needs it. I want him to believe he still has the room." He paused at the atrium entry. 14 men at the exits before anyone else arrives. The archive master with the original documents on the table before anyone else can get to them. Varath in visible custody, not hidden, not removed, visible, so every man who walks into that hall can see what cooperation looks like. He looked at Ren. "And I want every servant in this fortress to know, before that door opens, that the Alpha King's son was taken from his mother's gravekeeper and held in a catacomb under their feet." Ren looked at him. "Servants talk. That's why I'm telling the servants." He walked into the atrium. Kael's hand still in his, the boy's stride adjusting to match his without being asked. The 2 of them crossing the stone floor toward the Great Hall and the morning that was now fully committed to arriving. At the far end of the atrium, the Great Hall doors were closed. Behind them, in approximately 38 minutes, every man who had spent 12 years managing the shape of this kingdom to suit their own architecture would walk through those doors and arrange themselves at that table and look at their king. Kael's arm was still bleeding through the makeshift binding. His coat was torn at the shoulder from the catacomb floor. He had not slept and had not eaten and was running on something beyond what food and sleep could provide. The specific fuel of a man who has learned the truth about something he cannot unknow and is moving toward every consequence of it at full speed. He thought about the last line of Celine's letter one more time. Then he stopped thinking about it. What it said was in him now. What it said had become the direction. He stopped at the hall doors, looked down at Kael. The boy looked up at him. No fear in those gray-green eyes. Just the question. "In a few minutes," Kael said carefully, "you're going to walk into a room with a lot of men who do not want you in it." Kael considered this. "Why not?" Because you change what's possible in there. What they built only works if you don't exist." The boy was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've existed the whole time." "Yes," Kael said. "You have." He put his hand on the door. Behind them, Ren had already turned and was moving fast and quiet through the atrium. 14 names in his head, 40 minutes on the clock,
The specific, purposeful silence of a man who has been given a task that actually matters and intends to complete it. The great hall doors were solid iron-banded oak, 12 feet tall, older than the corridor outside them. They had opened for 3 kings. They had opened for coronations and tribunals, and the exile proclamation that had sent a pregnant woman into the November cold with a cloth sack and broken boots. They had opened for everything Kael had built and everything that had been built beneath him without his knowledge. He pushed them open. The hall was not yet filled. The torches were burning, the long council table was bare. The high windows were letting in the full, cold, pale light of a morning that had committed to arriving regardless of what anyone in this building preferred. 2 servants at the far end looked up, startled. The archive master, already sent for, was visible at the side door with a stack of documents under one arm, and the expression of a man who has been given orders he doesn't fully understand but intends to execute precisely. Everything was still in its potential. The hall still held the shape of what it had been before the doors opened. In 12 minutes, Kassan would arrive. In 12 minutes, the men he'd spent 12 years positioning would begin filing through the side entries and taking their seats, and doing what power does when it believes it still holds the room. Arranging itself, settling its weight, preparing to be immovable. In 12 minutes, for the first time since the Exile proclamation was read in this hall, someone was going to lay the tribunal records on this table in front of every man who had kept them buried. Kael walked to the head of the table, sat, felt the chair's familiar weight, the specific pressure of 11 years of decisions made from this exact position. Kael stood beside him, looking at the empty hall, taking its measure. "Stay close," Kael said. "I know," the boy said, and his voice had something in it that his mother's voice had carried in those letters. Not defiance, not bravado. Something quieter and more durable than either. The particular quality of someone who has survived the thing they were not supposed to survive and is now prepared to be present for whatever comes after. The hall filled with morning light. At the far end, the main doors swung open. Lord Kassin walked in first. He saw Kael. He saw the boy. He saw the archive master moving to the table with the documents. He saw, in the fraction of a second before his court face assembled itself, the precise shape of what had gone wrong. And in that fraction of a second, before the mask came back, Kael saw him look at the side exit to his right. Ren's man was already standing there. Kassin looked back at Kael. And Kael, for the first time since the gravekeeper had walked into his study in the pre-dawn hours, felt something in the room shift fully into his hands. He let Kassin take his seat. Let the other counselors file in. Drue, Mareth, 6 others, each one reading the room and making their rapid private calculations and settling into their chairs with the careful stillness of men who have walked into something they don't fully understand and are not yet ready to show that. Let the hall fill and quiet. Then he picked up the first document the archive master had placed before him. The original signed confession, Celine's name at the bottom in the handwriting he now knew better than his own, and held it up so the morning light came through it. 12 years ago, he said, this document was presented to me as evidence of betrayal. I signed an exile order based on it. His voice carried in the stone hall with the particular resonance of a room built to contain a king's voice. I want every man at this table to look at it. Silence. And then, he said, I want every man who touched this document to tell me how their hand got on it. Kassin's jaw was still. His hands on the table were controlled. His eyes, when they met Kael's across the length of the hall, held the specific calculation of a man who has one move remaining and is deciding when to make it. He opened his mouth, and somewhere in the walls of the fortress, deep in the stone, something that sounded like, and was not Shas, the festival drums began a low and rhythmic vibration that Kael recognized after a moment as the outer gates. The main outer gates, responding to... He turned to the window, saw the dust on the eastern road, saw the distant movement of something large and organized coming toward Ashenvale at speed. Not festival arrivals. The wrong direction for festival arrivals. Ren appeared at the hall's side entry, and his face said everything his voice hadn't had time to say yet. Kassin's last move, Kael understood, was not in this room. It was already on the road. The dust on the eastern road meant 200 men, maybe more. Kael read it the way his father had taught him to read distance and movement. Not the count, which you couldn't know from dust alone, but the weight of it. The pace.
The deliberate, organized pressure of a force that was not marching to arrive, but marching to demonstrate that arrival was inevitable. Cassine's last move had been made before the council session, before the catacomb. Possibly before last night, back when the commission was still on schedule, and the boy was supposed to be gone before dawn, and there was nothing left to surface. Kyle looked at Cassine across the length of the council table. Cassine looked back at him with the expression of a man who has placed a bet he cannot retract and has decided the only remaining dignity is in not flinching. "How many?" Kyle said. "Enough." Cassine's voice was steady, the voice of a man who has rehearsed this moment. "Enough to make a conversation instead of a verdict. That's all I'm asking for, Your Grace. A conversation between reasonable men about what stability actually requires. You brought an army to my gate to ask for a conversation. I brought a demonstration of how many people share my concerns about a 9-year-old boy." Cale's voice stayed level. "About a dead woman's letters. About a tribunal that had a forged confession at its center." He set the document down on the table. "That's what your army is here to manage." Cassine's jaw tightened. The tribunal findings were, "Don't!" The word came from Wren at the side entry, and it was the first thing Wren had said in the hall, and it landed with the particular weight of a man who has been patient for the full duration of his patience. "Don't say we're sound again. One more man says the tribunal findings were sound in this building, and I will personally—" He stopped, composed himself, looked at Kyle. Kale stood. He looked at each man at the table in turn, Drua, who had gone pale and was looking at his hands. Mareth, who was watching the side exits with the calculation of a man pricing options. The others, 6 men he had governed beside, argued with, trusted with the instruments of the realm, each of them doing their private arithmetic in the suddenly very clear morning light. "Wren," Kyle said. "The gate." "Already sent for," Wren said. "Garrison is assembling." "Not the garrison." Kale looked at him. "Open the gate." Wren stared at him. "Open it. Let them in, all of them." He looked back at Cassin. "I want them in the outer yard where everyone in this city can see them. I want every merchant and servant and tradesman in Ashenvale to be able to look over their fence and count Cassin's men and ask themselves why the Lord of the Eastern Compact brought 200 soldiers to the Blood Moon Festival." Cassin's composure cracked, one small fracture across the controlled surface. "That's not—" "You wanted a demonstration," Kyle said. "Let's demonstrate." The outer yard filled in 20 minutes. 230 men, it turned out. Kale watched them come through the gate from the upper parapet. Kale standing 3 feet to his left, both of them looking down at the organized formation assembling in the morning light below. The city was awake and watching. Word had moved through Ashenvale the way word always moved through a city built close, fast, doorstep to doorstep, the particular velocity of information that people recognize as significant before they understand why. The servants had talked. Kyle had told the servants, and the servants had talked, which was what he'd intended, and what they'd said had spread through the lower city in the pre-dawn hours, until the people who lived in the buildings nearest the fortress walls were standing at their windows and their rooftops looking at the same dust cloud on the eastern road that Kyle had seen from the Great Hall. By the time Cassine's men were in the yard, the upper walls of the fortress were lined with the inhabitants of the fortress's outer buildings. Cooks and stable hands and laundrywomen and the various essential people who keep a fortress running and are never in the room when decisions are made. They were watching the yard. They were watching the parapet where Kyle stood. They had heard about the boy, about the catacomb, about the letters. Cassine came to the parapet. He came because Kyle had sent for him specifically, and because a man who has just watched his military demonstration absorbed and reframed has limited remaining moves. He came and stood beside Kyle and looked out at his own men assembled below and at the people watching from the walls and did not say anything for a long moment. "You've made this public," he said finally. "It was always public. You just controlled who knew it. The realm's opinion of a dead exiled woman is not—" "Her name," Kyle said, "was Celine Vale. She was my mate. She was innocent of every charge brought against her. She died in a border town in November 6 years ago, carrying the weight of a conspiracy she didn't have the resources to fight, and she did it without once putting her name to a lie." He didn't raise his voice. The yard below was quiet enough that he didn't need to. "Her son is standing to my left. He's 9 years old. His name is Kale, and he is the heir to this throne,
and he survived the catacomb that your commission put him in before dawn this morning." The yard was silent, 230 soldiers standing in morning light, looking up at a parapet. The people on the walls looking down. The city of Ashenvale in all its ordinary permanence arranged around a moment it would recount for a generation. Cassin's men, Kael understood, were not fanatics. They were soldiers, men with contracts and loyalties that extended to the man who paid them, but not necessarily to the specific purpose they'd been pointed at. Men who had ridden through the night on a lord's order and arrived at a fortress at sunrise, and were now standing in a public yard while a king told a large audience what they had been sent to accomplish. He watched it move through them. The specific moment when 200 men recalculate. "Lord Cassin," Kael said, still not raising his voice, "you can bring your men into the fortress as guests and answer every question the council puts to you before noon, or you can attempt to use them as you intended and explain to the people of this city why you brought an army to silence a 9-year-old boy." He looked at the man beside him. "Choose before I count to 10, because after 10 I stop giving you the option to choose." Cassin looked at the yard below, at the walls, at Kael, standing 3 feet away, with those gray-green eyes taking in every detail of the scene below, with the systematic patience of a child who had learned to read rooms and was currently reading an entire city. "What happens to me?" Cassin said quietly. "Not a negotiation, a genuine question. That depends on what you tell the council." Kyle looked at him. "The full architecture, everyone involved, every arrangement Voss made and you ratified and whatever else runs beneath it. All of it, in a hall with witnesses, on record." He paused. "I'm not offering you comfort. I'm offering you the difference between a man who came forward and a man who was dug out." Cassin was quiet for a long time. Below, his soldiers stood in the thin morning light, the horses shifting and blowing, the collective weight of 200 men who had ridden hard and arrived somewhere different from where they'd been aimed. "My house," Cassin said, "my family's holdings, are not part of this conversation." Kyle said it flat. "Your family didn't build a conspiracy under my floor. You did. They're separate." Cassin exhaled. It was a long sound, the specific exhalation of a man setting down something he's been carrying for longer than it was worth carrying. "I'll talk," he said. The council session lasted until midday. Kael sat at the head of the table for 4 hours and listened to the architecture of 12 years disassemble itself into the record. Cassin talked. Verath, brought from confinement, talked more. Voss, who had been brought to the hall under guard and seated at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who has reached the end of a very long road and recognizes the destination, said little, but confirmed what was asked of him with the direct accuracy of someone who had decided that the last thing he could do was be precise. It was not clean. It was not a single conspiracy with clean edges. It was the thing power usually is when examined closely, layered, opportunistic, built from individual decisions that each seemed defensible in isolation and became something else in accumulation. Voss had identified Celine as a risk. Cassin had seen an opportunity in the risk. Vareth had been given a role he'd stepped into before understanding its full weight. Others, some at the table, some not, had received benefits from arrangements and asked few questions about foundations. Drew, halfway through the session, put his hands flat on the table and said, "I knew the evidence was thin. I didn't examine it because thin evidence for a conclusion I'd already reached is still a conclusion." He said it to no one in particular. Said it like a man reading a statement he'd prepared over the course of a lifetime and finally found the occasion for. Nobody responded. The archive master was writing. Kael listened to all of it. The account of what had been done to Celine, the specific sequence of coercion and isolation and manufactured testimony, came out in pieces, assembled from Verath's careful lawyer's memory and Cassin's more general recollections, and the documentary record that the archive master was pulling and cross-referencing in real time. Every piece that surfaced cost Kael something. He sat with the cost the way the catacomb stone had sat with cold, without apology, absorbing it fully. Kael was not in the hall. Wren had arranged for the boy to be taken to the king's own quarters, with 2 of the 14 men Wren had trusted, and a meal, and at Kael's apparently specific request, something to read. Kael had been told this and had felt something happen in his chest that he couldn't name cleanly. The boy had asked for something to read. In the king's quarters, with 2 guards outside, after a night in a catacomb, he had asked for something to read. His mother's son.
Folks, by late afternoon, the council chamber had done what it needed to do. The formal dissolution of the Cassin Eastern Compact arrangements would take weeks of legal work. The full accounting of what had been built under the Crown's knowledge would take longer, months, possibly a year of careful excavation. The border soldiers Cassin had brought were being housed, disarmed at their own agreement, fed, and would be released by morning. Nobody had died in the yard, which Kyle considered a significant achievement given how the morning had started. Voss was confined to his quarters under guard. Not the catacomb, the quarters. Kyle had made that decision and didn't explain it to anyone because the explanation was complicated and the day had been long. The truth of it was simpler. Voss was 64 years old and had done monstrous things for reasons he had believed were sound, and there would be a full accounting, and the accounting would be what it needed to be. But the catacomb was for something else. The catacomb belonged to something else now. He went to his quarters in the early evening. Kale was at the window when Kyle came in, sitting on the window bench with a book open on his knee, watching the lower city below where the last of the Blood Moon Festival detritus was being cleared from the streets. Lanterns still burned in some of the buildings, households that kept them lit through the day after, old custom for those still being mourned. He looked up when Kyle came in, closed the book without marking his place, which told Kyle something about his memory. "Is it over?" the boy said. Kyle sat down in the chair across from him. Let the question sit for a moment. "The immediate part," he said. "The rest takes longer." Kale nodded. He looked back out the window at the lanterns. "She lit one," he said, "every year. At the boarding house in Exile, she lit a lantern on the day after Blood Moon. She said it was for someone He stopped, reassembled. She said it was for someone who needed to find his way home. Kyle looked at the window, at the faint gold of the lanterns in the lower city, the ordinary light of ordinary grief burning against the evening. "I didn't know," he said. He said it because it needed to be said, not because it excused anything. "I should have. I burned what she sent me without reading it. He stopped. "There's no version of that where I was right." Kale looked at him. 9 years old, and his eyes did what his mother's had done, held steady, went deep, took the measure of what they were looking at without rushing the assessment. "She said that too," the boy said. "She said you weren't. She said you weren't a cruel man. She said you were a proud one. She said those are different." He paused. "She said proud men are harder to reach than cruel ones because they have better reasons." The room was quiet. Somewhere in the fortress, the ordinary sounds of evening. Footsteps, a distant voice, the settling of old stone. "I want to tell you something," Kyle said. "And I want you to know I'm not telling you so you'll feel a particular way about it. I'm telling you because you're old enough to have the truth, and your mother raised you to expect it." He looked at the boy. "I failed her, completely, and in ways I'll spend the rest of my life understanding the full shape of. I failed you before you were born. I'm going to spend however long I have trying to be worth the thing she believed I could eventually be, and I'm not going to ask you to call that forgiveness or call it anything before you're ready to." He paused. "You don't owe me a particular feeling. You owe me nothing at all." Kale was quiet for a long moment. The lanterns in the lower city burned their steady gold. "She told me," the boy said slowly, like he was reading something from a long distance, "that the hardest thing a person can do is want something from someone who hurt them and still tell the truth about what they want." He looked at Kyle. "She said she still wanted you to know us, even after everything. She said that out loud, in Exile, when she thought I was asleep. I was 5. The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. His mother's not quite smile, the one in the letters that appeared between sentences of plain practical prose. "I wasn't asleep." Kyle's throat closed on something he wasn't going to let into his voice. He held it there, held the whole weight of it, and let it be what it was. "She was smarter than me," he said, "in every way that mattered." "I know," Kale said, and this time the not-quite smile was complete. 3 months passed. The legal architecture of 12 years of corruption took most of them. The archive master worked through the winter with 3 assistants and a mandate from the Crown to produce a complete account, which he did with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had been waiting his entire career for someone to actually ask. The noble houses implicated in Cassine's arrangements were given the choice Kael had offered Cassine in the yard: full account or full excavation. Most chose account. 2 chose excavation and got it. Celine Vale's name was formally and publicly cleared in the 8th week. The proclamation was read in the Great Hall, in front of a full assembled court, in front of the Archive Master's complete record, in front of every surviving member of the original Exile Tribunal. Kael read it himself. He'd written it himself over 3 drafts in the small hours when Kael was asleep, and the fortress was quiet, and the only sound was the fire in the grate that he no longer used for burning anything. He sent a copy to Greyville, to Edric Sorn, who had gone home after the blood moon morning with the brevity of a man who delivered what he came to deliver and had a cemetery that needed tending. He sent the proclamation and a letter, which he also wrote himself, and which was short, which was the only honest length for what he had to say. The kingdom knows now. You were the only one who kept faith with her when it cost something to do it. I have no adequate word for that. I can tell you that her son is well, and that he is reading everything in the library with the same speed and focus she used to read, and that he has her way of looking at a room like it's a problem he's already halfway through solving. I think she would recognize him immediately. I think she would say something practical, and then she would not say anything else for a long time, because she was that way about things that moved her. I know that because I finally read her letters. All of them. Including the ones I burned. The ash is still in a container in a storage room below the study. I don't know what to do with it yet. I'll know eventually. Edric Sorn wrote back in 3 lines. The old man's handwriting was large and slightly trembling and absolutely legible. She knew you'd figure it out. She told me that the last year when figuring it out seemed like the least likely possibility. I told her she was optimistic past the point of reason. She said that was a feature, not a flaw. The cemetery is tended. The yew tree is healthy. Come see it when you're ready. The memorial room was Kael's idea. He proposed it in February in the practical tone he used for proposals, not asking exactly, not quite stating, but presenting as though he'd worked through the logistics and was now sharing his conclusions. He said there was a room at the top of the east tower that wasn't used and had good windows on 2 sides, and he thought the letters should be somewhere they could be read instead of somewhere they were stored. Kael had the room prepared. It took 2 weeks. The windows resealed against draft, the shelves built, the preservation work on the letters themselves done by the Archive Master's most careful assistant, who handled each one with the specific reverence of someone who understood they were handling something that had survived things it should not have survived. 11 letters, plus the last one, plus a single fragment of scorched paper no wider than 2 fingers that said, "I hope you are well. I hope the kingdom is," which Kael had carried in his breast pocket for 3 months, and placed in the center of the display with the same care he'd never given it when it could have mattered. The room had no particular ceremony to its opening. One morning, Kael went up to check the work, and Kael was already there, sitting in the window seat with his knees up and the first letter open in his hands, and the particular quality of stillness he had when he was reading something he was going to remember completely. Kael sat down in the chair by the door. They stayed there for a while. The boy reading, the king sitting with the morning light coming through the good windows and the letters arranged on the shelves in their preservation frames, and the ash fragment in the center of it all. He thought about what it costs to learn the truth late, about how the weight of it doesn't diminish because you finally arrive. It changes shape. It stops being the weight of not knowing, and becomes the weight of knowing completely, which is heavier in certain ways and lighter in others. He had spent 11 years moving through a kingdom built on a lie he'd been handed and hadn't examined. He'd moved through it efficiently, effectively, with the conviction of a man who believed he understood the ground beneath him. The ground had never been what he thought. What he understood now, not as a lesson he'd arrived at, but as something that had become structural, part of the load-bearing walls, was that strength built on what you refuse to examine is not strength. It is a performance of strength. And performances hold until they don't. And when they stop holding, the damage is proportional to how long you ran the performance and how many people were standing underneath it. He had run it for 11 years. He had burned 11 letters. He had stood on the eastern parapet every blood moon and watched the festival lanterns without allowing himself to understand what they were for. The kingdom was not fully healed. It wouldn't be, not in months, possibly not in years. The corruption Voss had built was systemic. It had roots in arrangements and alliances that would take careful, unglamorous work to properly address. Cale had told the council this in January and had not softened it, because the thing about spending 12 years on a false foundation was that it left you with very little patience for further softening. But there was Cale at the window, reading the letters his mother had written into the dark on the understanding that they were going into fire. Reading them in morning light in a room built to hold them, in a tower above a city that now knew her name and knew it differently than it had before. That was not nothing, that was not everything, but it was the thing that remained when the storm passed and the damage was assessed, and the work of rebuilding had to begin from whatever actually survived. Cale looked at his son. "She ends every one the same way," Cale said, without looking up. "Every letter. The last line is always the same." Cale knew. He'd read them all. "What does it say?" he said anyway, because some things need to be said aloud in a room built for them, by a voice that is allowed to say them. Cale read the last line of the letter in his hands. Celine's hand, Celine's words, 11 years old and still precise, still deliberate, still the handwriting of a woman who had learned caution down to her bones and written honestly anyway. "I believe you are better than this. I always will." The room held the words. Outside the windows, Ashenvale was going about its morning. The lower city was awake, the market was running, the ordinary machinery of people living their days moving through the streets below without knowing that above them, in a tower with good windows, a king was sitting with the truth about himself and finding not peace, not exactly, not yet, but the specific and difficult beginning of it. The next blood moon would come. They always came, the same slow red climb above the city, the same cycle turning regardless of what had happened since the last one. The lanterns would go out in the lower city, and the festival drums would sound, and the night would be what it always was. The old turn of the year, the dark that preceded the next morning. And in the East Tower, the letters would be there, preserved, readable, available to anyone who needed to understand what this kingdom had learned and at what cost. Cale stayed in the chair. Cale turned the page. Outside, the ashes had stopped falling.